every conversation inhabits a world of its own. Steve Reich, May 2021. Chapter 1. David Lang.
David Lang. In the mid-1960s, you began composing all these great radical pieces, but before that, you were a student in a music school, being educated to be a normal, well-disciplined, European-oriented composer. I wonder if before we get into all the things you've done since then, it might be interesting to find out what your life as a student was like. You went to Juilliard?
Steve Reich. Yes, but best to go back before that, to when I was 14 and discovered the music that really changed my life. I had piano lessons when I was younger, and I had heard Beethoven's Fifth, Schubert's Unfinished, Wagner's Overture to the Meistersinger, and lots of pop music. But at 14, I heard a recording of The Rite of Spring, and it made an enormous impression. I had never heard anything like it. Then, a few weeks later, I heard a recording of the Fifth Brandenburg Concerto. Believe it or not, I had never heard any Bach before that. Finally, a bit later, a pianist friend played me records of Miles Davis, Charlie Parker, and Kenny Clarke, and we immediately said we'd form a band. I said I'd be the drummer, and I began studying with Roland Koloff, who later became the principal timpanist with the New York Philharmonic. All of those experiences, starting when I was 14, really laid the groundwork for the rest of my life. At 16, I entered Cornell.
You were young.
I didn't know what I was going to major in. I was in a band, playing drums on the weekends. I was listening to much more Stravinsky and Bach and discovering early music and Bartók. But I felt Bartók began at 5, and I was 16, so it was too late for me to become a composer. Fortunately, besides becoming very interested in philosophy and Wittgenstein in particular, I immediately took a history of Western music course with Professor William Austin, who was a musicologist, pianist, organist, and specialist in 20th century music. He taught the course as follows. First semester began with Gregorian chant, went to the death of J.S. Bach in 1750, and then jumped directly to Debussy, Ravel, Stravinsky, and jazz. The second semester began with Haydn and ended with Wagner. Needless to say, I preferred the first semester, but more importantly, it clarified my instinctive attraction to Bach, Stravinsky, and jazz, showing how they all share a strong underlying rhythmic pulse and some form of tonal center. 19th century European Romantic music moves further and further away from both. Finally, the moment of truth came when I was a senior and had to make up my mind about where I was going. I applied to Harvard and was accepted as a graduate student.
In the philosophy department?
In the philosophy department. And I went to Austin and said, I can't do this. I want to study composition. He said, why don't you study with Hal Overton? Let me contact him. And he did. And I graduated from Cornell with honors in philosophy and went down to New York City to study composition with Hal Overton. You once mentioned you knew about him.
Well, you know, one of my hobbies, maybe my only hobby, is that I'm a record collector. I collect LPs of musicians, American composers from the 50s and 60s. You run across his music in a lot of really interesting places. You find him in the symphonic world, and you find him as Thelonious Monk's arranger.
Exactly.
So by the time you would have been introduced to him, he was already living a sort of dual life, questioning the role and the relationship of classical music to jazz.
Right. Hal Overton taught in a loft in what was called the Flower Market, which is Lower 6th Avenue. Later, a book of photographs was published called The Jazz Loft Project, because on the floor below Hal Overton was W. Eugene Smith, the photographer who constantly came up to Hal's loft to photograph jam sessions with Thelonious Monk, Charlie Mingus, Stan Getz, Phil Woods, Jim Hall, Zoot Sims, and all kinds of jazz musicians of that period.